Hello everybody, I hope you can hear me, and I'm just would like to welcome everybody to this course on technology and human rights advocacy. You've probably read the course introduction and the syllabus on the forum. If not, I encourage you to do so. Let me just tell you a few words about myself. I used to be a student organizer and one of the leaders of Otpor, the student resistance movement in Serbia some 12 years ago. And ever since I've been involved in disseminating knowledge about community organizing, organization management, campaign management for human rights advocacy. I was also involved heavily in different technological solutions to organizing, and I still work as a software developer in that field. I would like to start the session by taking a quick overview of the course. This is a course, as I said, on technology and human rights advocacy, and it will last for 8 weeks. One of the things we would like to do here in the course is to develop a campaign plan, and through developing this campaign plan we will actually learn some things about organizing, especially online. And every week we're going to have a small assignment, and these assignments need to be finished 24 hours before the class. Let me tell you a few words about the course requirements. Of course, you're required to do all the readings and attend classes and participate in online discussions to successfully complete the course. And apart from that, there is going to be a test similar to the test that you just did, with which is a multiple choice test. And there is also going to be a written assignment. This written assignment is actually the 2 pages, 1,000 words, and I will talk a little bit more about it, and there is more info on the forum. I posted it about that assignment. So let me tell you a few words about the written assignment that is important and actually necessary for successful completion of the course. The written assignment is actually a campaign plan which will contain the following elements. First, campaign objectives for the campaign of your choice, the campaign message with the samples for slogans, deliverables and other campaign material, a task list with responsibilities for main campaign managers and organizers, and a timeline of activities. So don't worry about the details yet, because all these elements of the plan will be developed through the course. So this is going to be the way we're going to progress in the course. We're going to develop one element after another, and by the end of the course, by early December, we're going to have a full campaign plan. So as we go through the course on technology and human rights advocacy, we're also, as you can see, going to focus on skill building, especially in campaign management, and especially for online campaigns and digital campaigns. So if now it's time to ask any questions, if there are any questions about the course. And of course, we will also, any questions that you may have later, you can actually post those questions on the forum underneath the syllabus message that I posted. So if there are any questions about this, we still have time, so you can post them on the forum beneath the note beneath the welcome note in that thread. So let me move to the course. So as you know, we're going to talk about human rights advocacy and technology, and this is a very broad topic, and we will of course narrow it down to the nexus of technology and advocacy, which is digital technology campaigning. But before we go to that level of detail, let us spend some time talking about human rights, and then talking about advocacy, and then talking about technology. And this is going to be the topic in our introductory class. So, do we have any answers to the questions? I would like to invite students, if you have any ideas or thoughts, how would you, in like 2 or 3 words, define human rights? This would be either through the chat box, or you can actually, if you want, you can even use the microphone to answer this. What would human rights be in your opinion? Okay, so far we have 2 comments here. Human rights are universal rights or common basic rights that everyone is entitled to. And another comment that we have is we have a freedom to defend our right. Any more? 1 or 2 maybe? The natural rights which anyone deserves to have after his birth. Basic rights that every human being has to have regardless of race and gender. Okay, this is great. The basic fundamental needs of human being, they shouldn't be violated. A set of rules humans have decided to give each other regardless of race, age, gender, etc. The right of living in a positive situation. Yeah, now we have several like specific and concrete rights like freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom to show to another people what are human rights. And then we have another comment saying it includes the basic rights of each citizen in civilized society, freedom of thought, speech, etc., etc. And another thought which says an atmosphere where human instincts are not violated. Well, you actually touched upon some very important elements of human rights, and these are, and I will just harvest from the comments that were already posted here. These are common rights everybody is entitled to. So this is universalism, that human rights are universal regardless of race and gender. And that these are natural rights that everybody has after his or her birth. But there is also a comment here saying that it includes basic rights of each citizen in a civilized society, which means that not just that these rights are natural, but they also have a legal basis as well. So yeah, you pretty much touched upon the most important elements of human rights, especially their universalism, their natural origin, and also their legal basis. So let us spend few minutes just looking at the origins of human rights. Here we have on the left hand side the Babylonian ruler Hammurabi, who was credited as a legendary lawgiver of ancient Babylon. So even in the laws of the ancient civilizations, there were prescribed some rules, not just for the citizens, but also for the rulers. And the rulers as well as citizens had to kind of stick to these rules. And the whole basis of legality is to avoid arbitrary decisions and to avoid situations where rulers will act in an arbitrary way. So this is where the, let's say, ultimate origin of human rights is. It took a lot of time for the concept of human rights to develop, and we can see on the upper right side King John and Magna Carta episode of the English history, which is well known as one of the examples and maybe even the most known and most discussed example of a ruler giving certain rights to his subjects. So there are many examples in the Middle Ages and even before where rulers were actually forced by their subjects to allow certain privileges and certain rights to different social groups. And so this is maybe the most, let's say, well-known example, at least in Europe. So under this picture we have two pictures of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and these are the two philosophers of the 17th century which were, let's say, most important proponents of the concept of natural rights, which actually is based in the premise that the sovereignty is not based in the divine rule or is not given by divinity, but sovereignty actually lies in the people, and this is where the modern concept of human rights actually is can be traced in the 17th century, and the Bill of Rights in England of the time contains a lot of these elements, and these two gentlemen were actually operational in that period of time. But it took two revolutions to actually declare these human rights in a more open and more explicit way, and these two revolutions happened at the end of the 18th century, and the first one happened in the United States of America, and at the time it was the 13 colonies of the British Empire. And in the Declaration of Independence, the founders of the United States put the following sentence: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness." So this was the founding document, the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. And the rights, specific rights of the citizens of this country were later listed in the section of the United States Constitution called the Bill of Rights. However, on the other side of the continent, it took a decade more, even more than a decade, for another revolution to happen. It is a French Revolution, and as a result of the French Revolution there was another declaration, and this declaration of the French National Assembly actually is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which declared in the second article that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Those rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression. So this particular document actually turned out to be of great importance to the politics of France and the politics of Europe for the whole 19th century revolutions, uprisings, and reforms in many countries around the continent, and not just in Europe but also elsewhere, were inspired by this particular document. And this is the the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. So these two declarations were the first political, let's call them documents, that declared the intent of these two countries, United States and France, that the countries will be dedicated to preservation and protection of human rights. In the French Declaration, it is not just the rights of citizens, but as it says, it's the right of man and citizens. So the basis is also on human rights, not just the rights of citizens of France. So this actually opened the door for universalism. And I won't bother you with the details of the politics in the next 150 years, but the slow progress of various international documents, international treaties and conventions, most notably the Convention of the Rights of Child, which was adopted at the end of the First World War, but that all led us to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And this Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the result of not just 150 years of international effort in promoting and let's say putting human rights on the international agenda, but it was, and I guess that is more important, it was the result of the Second World War and all the terrible things that happened, especially the Holocaust and the mass violations of human rights by Nazi Germany around Europe. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we can see here Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, American president, holding the first print of the declaration. This one is in Spanish. Under that picture we can see a session of the drafting committee which drafted the declaration, and on the right side we can see the moment when the United Nations General Assembly voted for the Declaration of Human Rights. It indeed was a universal declaration of human rights because all countries took part in drafting. The Soviet bloc at the very last moment decided not to vote for the declaration, actually to abstain. They didn't vote against, they just abstained in voting. And few countries like Saudi Arabia didn't vote. For instance, Saudi Arabia didn't vote because of certain rights regarding the women's rights and rights regarding the change of religion. But most other countries in the let's say Middle East, and we can call them the Muslim countries, they voted in favor of this declaration. One of these countries being also Iran at the time. So we can say that this declaration was truly universal. But on the other hand, as the name suggests, it's just a declaration. It's not a treaty. And the difference between declaration and a treaty is that the declaration just offers a statement of intent, but doesn't have any provisions how to implement this intent. The declaration, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, was followed by a number of treaties, and I listed all of them here. And these treaties focus on political rights, social rights, conventions to end racial discrimination, conventions against torture, conventions for the right of children, etc., etc. And all these treaties, these conventions, then later needed to be adopted by national governments and national parliaments of all the countries, and to be then passed into laws. But on the international level, the political bodies of the United Nations, on top the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations General Assembly, but also the United Nations Commissioner on Human Rights, which is a body that was replaced by the United Nations Human Rights Council 6 years ago. These bodies, as well as bodies that were established by all the treaties that I mentioned earlier, these bodies were actually supposed to monitor and to implement all these conventions. So let's see what were the mechanisms for implementation of these conventions. Do you have any ideas? I ask the participants now to give some feedback on this, to give some input on this. What were the mechanisms for implementation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the treaties that I just listed? Does anybody have any idea?
Well, I would say there will be some related NGOs that are their functions are they're mandated by United Nations to carry some of these. I would say UNHCR is one of them. Like you've written over here, ICC, the International Criminal Court, is one of them. And basically, I guess each nation should also be signing. For instance, just because you signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't mean that your country or your nation should be abiding by the laws of CEDAW, or or even mandated to do. Let's say if UNHCR had territory or legitimacy to operate in your country, doesn't mean that if they haven't signed those agreements, I guess that doesn't necessarily mean that they're abided to follow strategies, because each nation within itself has its own rules and regulations based on their own laws, and sometimes things like CEDAW or some of the rules with UNHCR don't necessarily agree with its constitutions or the laws of that nation. And I think that's when the implementation issues become difficult. For instance, the situation with the nuclear control of nuclear activities in Iran is one of the issues of implementation and policing or, controlling, abiding by some of the standards. Thank you.
Yes, I think that this contribution of yours is very helpful and valuable, because you pointed out to the various mechanisms of the implementation of all these treaties and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which rely on either the effort of the United Nations to monitor, to send teams, to send observers, and to create reporters, to send up reporters on human rights, to cooperate with NGOs, and at the bottom line is that it also depends on the countries how they're going to implement all these treaties and how they're going to fit those into their legal system. So the mechanism for implementation of human rights is very, very complicated, and it really depends on so much on the national or countries' legal implementation of all these treaties. If we look at some regional treaties and their bodies and their mechanisms of implementation of these conventions, we can see a very different mechanism of implementation. And if we look at the first example of that, which is the Council of Europe and their convention, European Convention on Human Rights, which was adopted in 1950, and it was at the time known as the Convention on Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, but now it is called the European Convention on Human Rights. We can see that as one of the most important mechanism in the implementation of this convention is the establishment of the European Court of Human Rights. And this is an important element of the implementation, because citizens in all the countries that signed the convention, the European Convention on Human Rights, the citizens, when they exploit all the means inside their countries to appeal to one court and then the higher instances in order to defend their rights, and if they exhausted all these, they can refer to the European Court on Human Rights, and this court will look at their case and will defend their rights if they are violated according to this convention. A similar thing is in the Organization of American States, which established and they actually drafted and adopted their own convention called American Convention on Human Rights back in 1969, and also the Organization of African Unity, which adopted the African Charter on Human Rights and People's Rights. Both of these organizations also established courts that are going to serve as mechanisms for that. But none of them is as established and as visible and as important as the European Court on Human Rights. So if we compare this to the situation that we have on the global level, and that is, the UN level. At the level of the United Nations, we don't have such a court. Maybe the ICC will at one point become such a court, and citizen of any country which is a member of the United Nations could maybe one day file a complaint there and to defend his or her rights. But at this moment this is not the case, and the United Nations human rights system does not possess such a mechanism, which will lead us to the next part of this session, of this class. But before we go into that, and before we answer how can we overcome this and how this is usually overcome, it is time now for you to ask questions, if there are any questions about this particular segment of the class. So let's move to the next segment. Because there is no court, because there is no mechanism for defending human rights, there is a greater need for different organizations, especially non-governmental organizations, individuals, and both formal and informal groups to actually do the job of promoting, monitoring, and advocating for human rights. And this is the role for human rights advocates in the situation where there is no global system for human rights implementation. So we turn to the next segment of this class, which we open with the question: what is advocacy? So if we can get in the chat box, and I will read the answers in few words, what do you think advocacy is? I'm sorry, I just saw that we had a question here. Why did the Soviet bloc didn't vote for human rights? I'm not really that big of an expert in that history, but to tell you what was their explanation. But this was part of the of the Cold War dynamic that was developing under the United Nations in 1948. So they didn't want to kind of be on board with the Western countries, which they already saw as their allies. They, on the other hand, were saying that they defend and protect all the human rights, which you know practically wasn't true. But the excuse they used is unknown to me. But we can put this question later on the forum and discuss it a bit more. Okay, so let's go to the answers about the advocacy. Advocacy, according to the answers provided here, supporting an idea actively, supporting certain beliefs, lobbying, campaigning, media. Okay, you read this here. Fighting for your rights. Yes, the answer is already there, but yes, I think we should ask what it is better to ask what it means. It is supporting and following human rights, defending and protecting. Advocacy means defending the human rights of citizens against whom it violates. Support is another meaning of advocacy. As one of the participants just said, I can express what Tavana is doing, spreading knowledge about what it is the first step, I think. Yes, and finally we have one comment which says it is impossible in Iran. We'll come down to that over this course. Yes, these are under this umbrella of advocacy. As you can see, there are different methods of advocacy, like lobbying, campaigning, using media, making coalitions, and these are different forms of advocacy. But what do you think advocacy is not? We have a question here.
Actually, advocacy is a situation where you have basically a situation where someone or something or a group is a victim or is violated. Their rights are violated. That's a situation where you have what we call a client. It's a violation of their rights. It can be a person, it can be a group, it can be a nation. Now, advocacy is knowing and understanding that violation and knowing that it's wrong and figuring out a way to rectify the situation and possibly punish the violators, the people who have taken the rights from the group or the individual or the nation. And advocacy is not necessarily about just rights. It can be about your environment. It can be about your, the food that you eat. It's got all different forms. So it's a matter of a violation of a situation of a group or a person, and it has the ways you figure out to remedy the situation, and sometimes it involves violating those who have taken the right of the other group or person.
Yes, that is correct. This what is listed on the cartoon are different methods of advocacy, but you're right. It does not necessarily need to be about human rights. Advocacy can be about almost anything that is in public concern and it is in your concern. However, the methods do define advocacy, because not every activity aiming to change the current situation can be considered advocacy. So that leads me to the next question. What do you think advocacy is not? What would be an activity that would not be considered advocacy? Running for office and participation in elections is not advocacy. Indeed, that is the only thing that is considered not being advocacy. So we have a comment here, and I would like to spend some time on it, which says, first we should say what is human rights, and it pretty much depends on what country we are living in and laws, etc. Even then, once more, we should seek how to defend it in possible ways in our own situation. Indeed, this leads us to the probably the most important question of advocacy, and that question is actually, what is the goal of advocacy? And the goal of advocacy is exactly, and especially if we talk about human rights advocacy, the goal of advocacy is to influence public policy and to influence decisions within the political system, social system, economic system, and within the institutions that constitute a government. So advocacy it can take different forms, as we saw earlier. It can take a form of lobbying, of public media campaigns. It can take a form of even rallies, civil disobedience, different forms of protest. It can take forms of community organizing, coalition building, but the goal of advocacy is to change policy. It is to influence the decision makers in government so they change policy. In our case, if we talk about human rights advocacy, this is the policy on human rights. This, as we said, sometimes it means changing laws. Sometimes it means putting an end to human rights violations that are in practice, and sometimes it means bringing human rights violators to justice. But it really depends on the situation, it depends on the country, and it depends on the capacity of the advocacy group to pursue the human rights advocacy effort. And one of the things we're going to learn during the course is how to do this better in terms of organizing campaigns for human rights advocacy efforts. So let me just spend a few minutes talking about this mechanism of change, as George Lakey put it in his work, in his master thesis back in the 60s. He was interested in why decision makers, politicians, leaders, some democratically elected, some more authoritarian, how do they change their policies, and how do they change their behavior and their positions? And he actually, points to three different mechanisms, as he called them, mechanisms of change. The first mechanism he calls conversion, which is, as he says, the genuine change of heart. That means that the ruler, the decision maker, the politician, is faced with a protest, a petition, some sort of an effort, and then he actually decides that he was wrong all along, and that these people are right, and then he decides to change his policy. And this George Lakey calls conversion, and this is a genuine change of heart. And as we all know, this happens so rarely that it is here only because of theoretical reasons. This particular mechanism of change is here. The second mechanism that he points out to is the mechanism of accommodation, and that is that the ruler or the decision maker is faced with some sort of a public pressure, and he or she decides to accommodate this public pressure through negotiations, through compromise, through certain steps in the direction of the proposed or change that is pushed for. So the dictator, the ruler, the democratically elected politician, it doesn't matter, decides to make certain changes not to fully satisfy those who are looking for change, but kind of to make some sort of a compromise. And the third mechanism he points out to is coercion. And this is when politicians, governments, more or less democratically elected, are forced to change their policies as a result of public pressure. And this is often the result of non-violent, broad-based movements that pressure governments to back down and to change their policies. On these three mechanisms of change, Gene Sharp later in 1990 added another one, which he called disintegration, and this is the situation where actually the institutions don't respond to the pressure and then they collapse as a result of a lack of response. And this is what we see happening when governments fall down because they never accepted the need of the people for reform. Because we saw in many situations in the last, let's say, 10 years where people are actually at the very beginning of the struggle just asking for reforms, but because the governments don't have an ear for that, then later they are forced to step down. So that leads to total disintegration of institutions. So if we look at the mechanisms of change, of course, conversion will rarely happen in this world, and disintegration is not very often either. So in most cases, the reason why policies are changed are a result of accommodation and coercion. Of course, after this happens, many politicians are going to say that they had a genuine change of heart and that actually they were supporting that policy from the very beginning. But this is just a politician's talk. I remember one of my friends from South Africa. Her name is Janet Cherry, and she was one of the organizers with the Union of Democratic Forces, which is the broad-based movement that was fighting against apartheid in the 80s in South Africa. And she told me that after the change, when talking to people who were supporting apartheid and who were actually loyalists to the apartheid regime, many of them, not just that they said that they were against apartheid all that time, but they sincerely believed that. So they went through this psychological transformation that they even forgot the fact that they were supporting such a regime for all those years, and they were actually genuinely believed that they were that the apartheid was a immoral, unjust system, and that they were against it. So it is very interesting that people actually believe that they're going through a conversion when they were actually going through a coercion, or in the case of South Africa, there were elements of accommodation and compromise as well. So we will discuss maybe more about these mechanisms of change at the forum, but it is important here to note that we are rarely talking about conversion. We are rarely talking about genuine change of heart. When we're dealing with policymakers, we are, as advocacy groups, talking a lot about pressure, talking a lot about coercion, and we're talking a lot about need for later negotiation and compromise as this pressure mounts to the point where it is unbearable. So let's look a little bit at the paradigm for human rights advocacy. For many years, human rights advocates in many countries were faced with the policymakers that didn't want to listen to them. And the main ally they could look for was international community. International community could apply diplomatic pressure, international community could provide necessary assistance, and the international community could elevate things to a level which actually makes the politicians very difficult to resist. This is especially true for individual cases of very how shall I say well publicized human rights violations of dissidents during the Soviet times, where the case of any particular dissident would be elevated to a level internationally where for the government there would be no other way but just to let this person leave the country and go. So this at that time was very, very much used way of human rights advocacy. So human rights advocates were communicating, if we can say, with the policymakers of their countries, but they were also, and maybe sometimes even more, communicating with the international community. And this established this indirect pressure element in the whole dynamic. So, for instance, direct pressure would be on the relation between human rights advocacy group and the policymakers. But involving international community is actually bringing an important ally and adding to this pressure. But in many cases, especially recently, this element does not help. Sometimes it even hurts. And sometimes the international community does not have the necessary diplomatic capacity to pressure a certain government. For instance, if I look at the case of Serbia, where I was working back in the 90s, by the end of the 90s, all the diplomats left Serbia, and there was no significant international presence in Serbia anymore, which actually meant that the diplomatic pressure on Milošević's regime became weaker. And this was certainly the case after the bombing of Serbia, and when actually all the Western countries practically declared war on Serbia, and where Milošević was even indicted for war crimes, which actually closed all the doors and all the diplomatic channels. So it became impossible to rely on international community to defend particular cases of human rights violations in Serbia, because the channels, all the diplomatic channels, were completely closed. So this is an example of let's say a country under the state of war and in kind of big conflict with the international community. But there are other cases where international community does not help, and there are cases where the international community doesn't want to help. For instance, just look at just compare situations in Libya and in Syria. for instance. In Libya, international community was very quick to get involved in the conflict. We can discuss whether this helped or not, but they were very quick to get involved in the conflict between Gaddafi and the protesters, and later the rebels. In the case of Syria, after more than a year, the international community is still not getting anywhere near they were in the case of Libya. And we can say this is because of the different interests and the different interests of the Western countries and the different international position of Syria. But this just shows that sometimes you just can't rely on the international community because they don't want to get involved. This is certainly true if we look at human rights violations in countries which are close to certain, let's say, big powers, and where they can actually, where they are allowed to do things just because of that. So again, relying on international community is sometimes not the wisest thing to do. So to move from this old paradigm to the new one, we will look at a different situation where instead of relying on the international community, human rights advocate relies on the public. And this public participation actually will provide this necessary pressure that will force the policymakers to change their policies. What does this mean? This means that the community organizing and the coalition building are becoming a very important elements of human rights advocacy effort. As important as documenting human rights abuses, as lobbying, as reporting, community organizing, and having relations with the general public is becoming more and more important. And these two don't exclude each other, and the fact that human rights advocates are relying more on the general public doesn't mean that they need to stop communicating and including international community in building of this pressure. So this just means that relying on community organizing and relying on coalition building is becoming a more and more important part of the human rights advocacy. So this is evident. If you look at the human rights advocacy efforts in the last 20 years, you can see this increase in public support, public participation in these efforts. Then when you look at certain efforts that were happening back in the 70s or in the 80s. But if we ask ourselves, why is this so? Why did this change happen in the last 10 years or more? Why this paradigm shift? I'm going to quote Jessica Matthews from her seminal article Power Shift, where she, and we will discuss this more on the forum later, but in this article she's actually talking about the change in the global civil society in the last couple of years, which led to the power shifts, which were the result of, as she says, computer and telecommunication revolution. So let me just quote her. The most powerful engine of change in the relative decline of states and the rise of non-state actors is the computer and telecommunications revolution, whose deep political and social consequences have been almost completely ignored. So, practically, what she says here is that the technology allowed for this public participation in human rights advocacy efforts. It wasn't a small group of human rights advocates who had access to resources, who had access to contacts, who had access to maybe the international community or anything that gave them this privileged status, and they would be running the human rights advocacy effort. Today, with the use of information technology and computers and internet, we actually can have much broader coalitions of people, both formal and informal, that are going to be engaged in this effort. And this is what this course is going to be about. So, you know, when Jessica Matthews wrote this article, this was still in the late 90s, and this technology looked very promising, and it was even called liberation technology by Larry Diamond. And he defined liberation technology as technology that enables citizens to report news, expose wrongdoing, express opinions, mobilize protest, monitor elections, scrutinize government, deepen participation, and expand the horizons of freedom. So this is a very optimistic take on the role of technology. It was questioned later by many authors, and this is one thing we're going to talk about during the course. But I just want to, at this point, emphasize this new element in the social and political dynamic practically in the whole world. And this is the computer and the internet and everything that the computer and internet revolution brought. And that is the possibility of people to connect with other people, to look for ideas, to disseminate information, which is now more decentralized than ever before in human history. So one thing that we will discuss later in the course is the dynamic between the governments and regimes who want to prevent people from using these technologies and the ways around. And this has been an ongoing dynamic all over the world. And people who are trying to use this technology to expand freedom, and people who are trying to use this technology to diminish freedom, this is an ongoing battle. But even this battle proves that technology, and especially internet and the computer information technology, is the battlefield where this, especially freedom of information battle, is being waged at the moment. So we're gonna spend a few minutes on this particular segment of advocacy, and especially the change that happened in the last 10-15 years when it comes to advocacy and its use of technology. So everything that we covered so far, are there any questions or comments? I see here there is a comment that the only example of conversion, of the genuine change of heart, is Philip of Denmark in 1849. So this would be an interesting thing to talk about later on the forum. I'm really interested in this particular example. But are there any other comments or questions about this segment concerning advocacy, concerning the methods and mechanisms of change, and concerning the role technology in this paradigm shift that happened when it comes to, in the last 10 years, 15 years, when it comes to human rights advocacy. Sanctions as the tool of international community cannot be considered a form of advocacy per se, because it is not the tool of the human rights advocacy group. They cannot perform sanctions. However, human rights advocacy group can push for sanctions. It can actually ask the international community to implement sanctions. We will see, we can discuss on the forum more, and we will see later the examples of different human rights advocacy groups and their efforts for that. But so far, just to answer this question, the human rights advocacy group cannot by itself perform any sanctions. This is indeed very troubling. This question troubles me too, because the Syrian conflict is going on for such a long time, and it's very devastating. The pictures that we see from coming out of Syria and the accounts that we hear coming out of Syria are very troubling. And it is indeed, the situation is indeed different, and the interests of the international community, especially big players, are different when these two countries are concerned. There is also the difference in the position of regional players and their involvement in the conflict. For instance, in the case of Syria, you can see that the regional context is much more complicated than the context in Libya. And so some of the big powers that were pushing for even for armed intervention in Libya are now hesitant to push for something similar in Syria. And I mentioned France, for instance, as the example of that. On the other hand, you also see that there are elections in United States, and the United States doesn't want to take any leading role there. So we can discuss this in greater detail, but the bottom line is that relying on international community is not always the international community does not guarantee that it will answer the calls for help. So this is yet another reason why to rely on creating the internal capacity for this.
بهره برداری امن از موبایل و اینترنت، زن، حقوق فردی و اجتماعی، سازوکارهای جلوگیری از نقض حقوق بشر، پویشی در مفهوم دموکراسی، مروری بر پایگیری نهادهای مدنی در ایران، اندیشه‌های نوین از حقوق کارگران، آموزش خبرنگاری، حقوق شهروندی امروز و محیط زیست. توانا رایگان توانایی ما را به سمت انسان امروزین جهانی متمدن تازه می کند. برای شرکت در این کلاس ها به توانا.org بروید و با جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. از طریق فیسبوک، توییتر و شبکه یوتیوب می توانید آموزشکده توانا را دنبال کنید. توانا آموزشکده است برای جامعه مدنی ایران.